The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878, and it smelled faintly of pine resin and something sharper, something that made David Barker think, even before he had unfolded the single page, that whoever had written it had done so in a hurry, or perhaps in a temper, or both. He had been standing at the wooden counter of the Millhaven post office in eastern Kansas, his hat still pushed back on his head from the ride in, his boots leaving red dust on the swept floorboards, when old Clarence behind the counter had slid the envelope toward him with a look that suggested he already knew the contents were going to cause David trouble. David tore the seal and read. The letter was from his older brother, Thomas, who had settled 2 years prior outside the town of Crayles Crossing in the New Mexico Territory. Thomas ran a cattle outfit, modest, honest work, building something in the dry red country where the grass grew thin and the sky went on forever. David had been planning to join him for months, saving wages from his work on the Mueller Ranch, but one thing and another had kept him delayed. A lame horse, a harsh winter, the quiet gravity of a life half-built that was difficult to leave, even when it offered nothing permanent. Thomas's letter began with the usual news: rainfall, cattle prices, the state of the pasture fence, but halfway down the page it shifted into something David had not expected, and he stood very still when he reached it. "There is a woman at the Hollies property which borders mine to the south," Thomas had written in his careful, slightly cramped hand. "Her name is Susanna Reed. She has been keeping that land alone since old Harlan Hollies died last autumn, and she has refused every offer to buy her out, which has made her a fair number of enemies in the county. She is described by most of the men in Crayles Crossing as difficult. I will tell you honestly, David, that she has thrown one man off her porch with a cooking pot and sent another riding hard back to town after a 10-minute conversation about water rights. The Harrington outfit has been pushing her hard, trying to get the land cheap, and it is getting worse. She needs someone steady beside her. She has agreed reluctantly, and with conditions I would call extensive, to consider a male arrangement with a man who is serious and not a fool. I have taken the liberty of putting your name forward. I am enclosing her terms below." The terms took up the bottom quarter of the page in a different hand, darker ink, more angular letters, written with a pressure that had almost gone through the paper in places. The hand read, "He must be a working man with no debt and no wandering habit. He must understand that this land is mine, was left to me by a man who treated me like family when my own did not, and I will not sign it over to anyone for any reason. He must be capable of mending fence, moving cattle, and tolerating silence without making it mean something it does not. He must know that I am not looking for sentiment. I am looking for a partner who can hold this property with me until such time as I can afford to hold it alone. If he can agree to these terms in writing and present himself before the end of May, I will meet him once. Beyond that, nothing is promised." Below the terms, in Thomas's hand again, "I told her you were a decent man. Do not make a liar of me. Come soon. The Harrington outfit is not patient." David had not finished reading the last word before his hand was already folding the letter back along its crease. He stood in the post office for a moment longer than was reasonable, the afternoon light coming through the single window and laying a yellow rectangle across the dusty floor. He thought about what he knew of himself, 31 years old, no debt to his name, no wife, no binding reason to stay in Millhaven beyond the fact that leaving required a decision, and decisions of a certain weight had always asked him to stand still for a moment before they could be made. Then he thought about the letter, about the handwriting that had almost gone through the paper, about a woman alone on a piece of land she refused to give up, throwing men off her porch because they deserved to be thrown. He set his hat straight on his head and walked out to his horse. He was saddled and pointed west before the dust from his boots had settled on the post office floor. The ride from Millhaven to Crayles Crossing in the New Mexico Territory was not a short one even in good weather, and the weather in May of 1878 was not entirely good. David covered the first 3 days in strong wind that came off the flat country and pushed at his back like something impatient. Then the trail descended into the river breaks of the Canadian River country, and he lost half a day finding a safe crossing at a place where the spring melt had turned the ford into something that was not a ford anymore. His horse, a broad-chested roan named Copley, steady and without drama, put his feet down carefully and got them both across without complaint. David camped 2 nights out in open country, building small fires and eating the salt pork and hardtack he had packed, and he spent those evenings with Thomas's letter on his knee, reading the bottom quarter again. Not the conditions. He had already committed those to memory the way you commit a piece of country to memory when you know you are going to be riding through it in the dark, not because you need to, but because it seems like the sort of thing that ought to be done. He read the handwriting itself. The pressure of it, the way certain words were heavier than others, land, mine, alone, as though she had been pressing a point home to someone who might not otherwise understand it. It did not read like the letter of someone who was difficult for the pleasure of it. It read like the letter of someone who had learned, through specific and probably painful experience, that being easygoing cost more than it was worth. He found that he respected that considerably. He arrived in Crail's Crossing on the 9th day of May, which gave him 3 weeks before her stated deadline, and he rode up the main street of town with the awareness that Crail's Crossing was the kind of small western settlement that noticed a new face immediately and filed it away for later discussion. The town ran along a single main road, with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with a faded sign that read Marshall's followed by something that had weathered away, a small land office, and a church at the far end that was perhaps the newest-looking building in the whole row. There was a water trough where he stopped to let Copley drink, and an older man in a leather apron watched him from the doorway of the blacksmith shop without any particular expression. Thomas's ranch was 4 miles south of town, and David found it without difficulty. A clean, practical spread of modest buildings, good-looking cattle in the near pasture, and Thomas himself standing in the yard when David rode in, looking older than David remembered, but in a way that suggested the years had been useful rather than hard. They shook hands hard, and Thomas looked him over with the frank assessment of a man who has been a brother for 31 years and therefore cannot be deceived about most things. "You came fast," Thomas said. "The letter was convincing," David said. Thomas almost smiled. "Come inside. I'll tell you what I know." What Thomas knew came over coffee and a plate of beans and cornbread, sitting at the rough pine table in Thomas's kitchen, while the evening fell outside and the cattle in the near pasture made their low sounds in the cooling air. Harlan Hollies had been a cattleman of the older generation, the kind who had come out to New Mexico in the early 1860s when it was truly wild country, and had stayed because he liked the difficulty of it. He had run a good-sized operation on the land south of what was now Thomas's spread, and he had done it with character. When his own children had grown and gone east to lives that had no room for red dust and hard seasons, Hollies had hired a woman named Susanna Reed as a combination of housekeeper, ranch hand, and Thomas was careful with this word companion, in the way that lonely old men sometimes form the kind of friendship with fierce young women that surprises everyone including themselves. Susanna had been 23 when she came to the Hollies' property. She had come from somewhere in Missouri. Thomas did not know the full story, only that there had been family trouble of the kind that results in a young woman being essentially on her own in a country that did not make that easy. She had been working at the general store in Crail's Crossing when Hollies had hired her, and she had proved herself worth 10 times whatever he paid her within the first season. She knew cattle. She could read weather. She could drive fence posts with an accuracy and efficiency that embarrassed men twice her size. Hollies had left the property to her outright in his will, not a portion, all of it. This had made the Harrington outfit furious, because Marcus Harrington had been expecting to purchase the Hollies' land when the old man died, and he had made arrangements and plans based on that expectation, which was not a legal claim but which Marcus Harrington had evidently decided was more binding than a dead man's will. He had made 4 offers to buy Susanna out. She had refused all 4. His approach had shifted over the following months from offers to pressure fences cut, a water source partially blocked, cattle moved off their range without obvious explanation. Nothing he could be easily prosecuted for, enough to make a woman alone feel the weight of it. "How old is she now?" David asked. 26 this past February, Thomas said. "And before you ask, she is not a woman who takes well to being handled. She will not be won over by charm or by patience or by any quality you think you might have that other men lacked. She will make up her own mind in her own time, and if she decides you are not worth the effort, she will tell you so plainly." "Good," David said. Thomas looked at him across the table. "You are taking this awfully calmly." "I am not calm," David said. "I am interested. Those are different things." Thomas shook his head slowly, the way an older brother does when he has said what he can say and knows it will not change anything. "I wrote her this morning that you had arrived. She sent back word that she would see you the day after tomorrow, not before, and that you should come at mid-morning and not earlier." "Not tomorrow." She said she needed a day to think about whether she wanted to bother. David set down his coffee. "That is fair." He spent the next day helping Thomas with a fence line that needed mending in the south pasture, working in the good silence that comes between men who have known each other long enough that they do not need to fill every hour with words. The work was honest and the day was warm with a clean, dry heat that smelled of juniper and warm earth, and David found himself looking, more than once, toward the low rise of land to the south where the Hollies' property began, as if looking long enough might tell him something about the woman on the other side of it. It told him nothing. It looked like good land. He arrived at the Hollies' property on a Thursday morning, the 11th of May, riding Copley at a steady walk along the track that led from the road to the yard. The property was visibly a working ranch, not prosperous but functional, with the careful, maintained quality of something that is being held together by determination rather than abundance. The fences were well kept. The cattle he could see in the south pasture were in good condition. The house itself was a solid adobe structure with a wide porch, and there were chickens in the yard and a vegetable garden on the east side of the house that was clearly being tended with serious intention. Susanna Reed was standing on the porch when he rode into the yard. He had not known what to expect, and he was not certain in that first moment that he could have put into words what he was experiencing. She was a tall woman, not unusually so, but taller than most, with a straight, deliberate posture that suggested she had decided some time ago not to make herself smaller to accommodate anyone's expectations. She had dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck, and she was wearing a plain brown work dress with an apron and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. And there was a smear of what appeared to be wood ash on her left forearm that she had not bothered to remove before his arrival, which told him something. She was watching him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was also not offering anything yet. A measuring expression, the kind a person develops when they have learned that first impressions can be engineered and therefore should not be trusted without examination. Her eyes were a dark amber color. He noticed that first, and then immediately told himself that noticing it was not the point. He dismounted, tied Copley to the post at the edge of the yard, and walked toward the porch. He took his hat off when he reached the steps. "David Barker," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Your brother is not subtle. Come up." She did not offer to shake hands, and he did not push it. He came up the steps and stood on the porch with her, and they stood for a moment in the morning air with the smell of coffee coming from inside the house and the sound of the chickens in the yard below. "Sit down if you want," she said, gesturing to the pair of wooden chairs on the porch. "I made coffee. I'm not going to pretend I made it for your benefit. I make coffee every morning, but there is some." "I would be grateful," he said. She went inside and came back with 2 enamel mugs, and they sat in the chairs with the morning sun moving across the yard and the coffee hot between their hands. He waited. He had the sense that the next word spoken should be hers, and he was right about that. "Your brother says you are not in debt and not a wanderer," she said. "He also says you are steady. I have found that people are called steady when others do not know what more interesting thing to say about them, so that description tells me very little." "That is a fair observation," David said. She looked at him. "What would you say about yourself?" "I would say that I am capable of the work you described in your letter. I would say that I have no interest in your land except as something to help protect and maintain. I would say that I came a long way because your letter sounded like it was written by someone worth coming a long way for, and I would rather say that plainly than pretend I have some more practical reason." She was quiet for a moment. He could not tell if he had said something wrong. "That is not a sentiment I asked for," she said finally. "No, but you asked what I would say about myself, and that is the honest answer." Another pause. She took a drink of her coffee. "The conditions in my letter stand. I want to be clear about that. I am not looking to be rescued. I am not looking for a husband in the way that most men think about what a husband means. This land is mine and I intend it to stay that way." "I understand," David said. "No," she said with a small precision. "You think you understand. Men generally think they understand things like this until the time comes when it costs them something, and then it turns out they understood something else entirely. I am telling you now so that later there is no confusion." He met her eyes. They were very direct, those amber eyes. They did not flinch from the weight of what they were looking at, which at this particular moment was him. "All right," he said. "Then I will say it back to you so we are clear. This land is yours. Decisions about this land are yours. I am here because your brother asked and because I chose to come, and if you decide I am not what you need, I will go without argument. I am not going to pretend that there is not something in me that is more interested in this situation than the practical arrangements account for, but I am also not going to act on that in any way that you have not asked for. Is that clear enough?" She studied him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but the slight lowering of a wall that has been up so long its owner sometimes forgets it is there. "You can stay in the bunkhouse," she said. "There is one hand a man named Cal who has been with this property since Harlan's time. He is old and mostly useful for knowing where things are rather than lifting them, but he is good company and he will show you what needs doing. If you prove yourself useful in the first week, we will discuss the arrangement further." "That is fair," David said. "I am not trying to be fair," she said. "I am trying to be precise. There is a difference." He almost smiled. He held it back because he thought smiling too soon would be the wrong thing. And he was learning quickly, because she was the kind of person who required fast learning, that the wrong thing with Susanna Reed was something he very much did not want to do. Cal was an older man of perhaps 60, wiry and brown as dried leather, with a white mustache that he kept trimmed with great care, and a way of moving around the ranch that suggested he knew where every fence post was not just by sight but by long personal relationship. He showed David the bunkhouse, a simple room with 2 cots, a small stove, and a window that looked east, and then walked him around the property for the rest of that first afternoon with the measured, unhurried narration of someone who had earned the right to take his time. The land was a good piece of country. There was a spring on the east side that ran clean, and pasture that was adequate for the herd. Susanna was running 43 head of solid beef cattle, plus 6 horses including Copley's new neighbor in the paddock, a large gray mare named Vera who belonged to Susanna and had an opinion about most things. The fence lines were the property's weakness. 3 sections of the north boundary had been cut within the past 2 months, and Cal showed them to David with a grim, quiet anger that was more eloquent than complaint would have been. "Harrington's people?" David asked. "Nobody else has a reason," Cal said. "Nobody ever catches them at it. Miss Reed rode out twice last month when she heard cattle moving at night, but they were gone before she got close enough to see faces. David studied the cut fence line. The wire had been snipped cleanly, a purposeful cut, not a break from weather or wear. "What does Harrington want with this land specifically?" "Water," Cal said. "That spring runs under the east pasture and comes up clean on this side. Harrington's land to the east has been drying out for 2 years. He knows that spring is worth more than the cattle and the buildings together." David looked at the fence and then looked toward the east, where the land rose slightly toward the Harrington boundary. He understood now what the stakes were. This was not a man making offers in good faith and being turned down by an obstinate woman. This was a man trying to exhaust a woman into selling something he needed, by making her life difficult enough that selling became the easier choice. He filed that understanding carefully and went to work. The first week was physical work: fence repair, pasture clearing, moving a section of the cattle herd to better grazing on the South Range. David worked from first light to last, and he did it without being asked twice about anything. And he did it with the focused, efficient quality of a man who has learned that work done properly the first time saves time later. Cal watched him with the cautious approval of someone who has seen many men come to a ranch and knows the difference between those who work hard to be noticed and those who work hard because that is what the work requires. Susanna watched him too, though she was less obvious about it. She was always doing something of her own, tending the garden, managing the books in the small office off the main room of the house, handling the chickens and the kitchen with a brisk, no-wasted motion efficiency that he found, when he caught glimpses of it across the yard, oddly compelling. She was not a woman who rested. She was a woman who moved from one necessary thing to the next with the calm intensity of someone who has done the accounting of what needs doing, and found that there is always more of it than there is time. On the 5th evening of his first week, she came to the fence line where he was finishing a repair on the north section, in the low golden light before sunset, carrying a water canteen and 2 pieces of cornbread wrapped in cloth. She handed him the water without preamble. "Cal says you have done the north section and the 2 east corners. The west corner post needs to be set more deeply," he said, drinking the water. "I will get to it tomorrow." "I know about the west corner post," she said. "I put it in myself 3 years ago and I was in a hurry." She paused. "I am not saying that you should not fix it. I am saying that I know it needs fixing and I have been meaning to get to it and I have not." He looked at her. There was something in the way she had said that, something in the slight deliberateness of the admission, as though acknowledging that there was something on the property she had not managed to get to was a thing that cost her something small but real. "There is more fence than one person can maintain alone," he said, without particular emphasis. "Yes," she said, not defensively, just agreeing with a fact. He took the cornbread. It was good cornbread, better than good actually, with a slight sweetness and a texture that suggested she had been making it long enough to have opinions about it. He said so. "Harlan liked it sweet," she said, with a look that was distant for just a moment, the look of someone who has recently lost someone important and has mostly made peace with it, but occasionally finds a corner where the peace has not fully arrived yet. He had what he called a civilized palate for a man living in the desert. "He sounds like he was a good man," David said. "He was the best man I knew," she said simply, with a directness that was not an invitation for further questions, but was also not a closing of the subject. It was just the truth, stated plainly, because that was how she dealt with true things. They stood at the fence in the evening light for a few minutes without speaking, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that settles between 2 people when they are both capable of being present without needing to perform presence. David noticed that the sunset over the mesa to the west had turned the sky an extraordinary color, a deep orange red that leaned toward the specific shade of the local sandstone, as though the land and the sky were in conversation about something they found mutually important. He did not say anything about it, but he thought, standing there with the sun going down and the cornbread in his hand and Susanna Reed 3 feet away looking at the same sky, that he was glad he had come. The trouble arrived on a Saturday, 12 days after David had come to the Hollies' property. It came in the form of 3 men on horseback, riding up the track from the road in the early afternoon, while David and Cal were in the barn working on a wagon wheel that had cracked on a rock crossing the South Creek. Susanna was in the house. David heard the hoofbeats and went to the barn door. The 3 men were Harrington riders. He knew them for what they were before he could see their faces clearly, because they rode with the particular loose arrogance of men who are on someone else's land, and know they have the backing of someone who considers that distinction unimportant. The one in front was a broad man in his late 30s with a thick, dark mustache and the kind of flat, assessing eyes that suggested he had learned long ago to calculate the situation in any room before he bothered to introduce himself. His name, David would later learn, was Cord Pasley, and he was Marcus Harrington's foreman, the man sent to do the work that Harrington himself preferred to be insulated from. Susanna had come out onto the porch. She stood with her arms at her sides, not crossed, which was not a relaxed posture but a ready one. "Miss Reed," Pasley said, stopping his horse in the yard, "Mr. Harrington sent me out to let you know his offer stands. He is prepared to raise it 10% above what he told you in March." "Tell Mr. Harrington," Susanna said, with a calm and distinctly unfriendly precision, "that I have no interest in his offer at any price. This is the 5th time someone from his outfit has ridden out here with a variation of the same message, and my answer has not changed because he has not changed anything about the situation that would cause my answer to change." Pasley looked around the yard with deliberate slowness. His gaze settled on David for a moment, noting him, filing him away. "You have taken on help. That is not your concern," she said. "Mr. Harrington is going to be interested to hear that," Pasley said, with an inflection that was technically neutral and not at all neutral. "Mr. Harrington is welcome to be interested in whatever he likes," Susanna said. "What he is not welcome to do is send men onto my property without invitation. I would ask you to leave now." Pasley looked at her for a long moment with those flat eyes, then turned his horse, and his 2 companions followed him back down the track without further words. David watched them go and then looked at Susanna, who was still standing on the porch with the same contained, steady posture. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "Since October," she said. "When Harlan died. 7 months of offers and fence cutting and cattle moving, and one occasion where someone put a dead rabbit on my porch, which I assume was meant to be a message and which I found mainly insulting to my intelligence." She looked at him. "I want you to know that I am not frightened. I am angry." "I know the difference," he said. "Most people do not," she said. That evening after supper, she spread a survey map of the property on the kitchen table and they sat across from each other, and she showed him the specific points of concern. The water spring, the north boundary which was closest to Harrington's line, the South Creek crossing where the access to the south pasture could be blocked by someone who knew the lay of the land. She spoke about each point with an exactness and a knowledge of her own ground that impressed him thoroughly. This was not a woman who had inherited land and was holding it out of stubbornness. This was a woman who knew every acre of this property in the way that people only know places they have genuinely loved and worked. "If he cannot buy it," David said, "what does he do next?" She looked at the map. "He makes it impossible to run. He runs my cattle off their range, blocks my water access, makes it so that keeping this place costs more than I have. Eventually he hopes I will decide that selling at his price is better than losing everything and getting nothing." "He does not know you very well," David said. She looked up at him. "No," she said, "he does not." In the pause that followed, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in any way that either of them would have been able to precisely identify, but a degree of something, a degree of alignment. David thought about the letter and its dark, pressured handwriting, and the conditions she had set out, and the way she had said "I am angry" instead of "I am frightened." And he thought about the 7 months she had spent on this land alone, holding the line against a man with more money and more riders and no scruples. And he felt something in his chest that was neither purely practical nor purely sentimental, but was a mixture of the two that he did not yet have a name for. He did not say any of it. He looked at the map. "The north boundary is the priority," he said. "If we put in a solid line of posts and triple strand the wire, cutting it becomes a significantly more visible and time-consuming operation, harder to do in the dark without being heard." She studied him. "That will take a week of solid work." "Yes," he said. "I can help," she said, not like a question. "I know you can," he said. That earned him something. Not a smile, not exactly, but the very faint relaxation at the corners of her mouth that, he was beginning to understand, was what a smile looked like on Susanna Reed when she was not ready to commit to one. They worked the north boundary fence together over the following week, and David would remember that week years later, in a different context, with a different set of reasons to remember it, as one of the most distinctly alive passages of his life up to that point. The work was hard and the days were long, and the sun came down on them with the full weight of a New Mexico May. And Susanna Reed in work clothes with her hair escaping its knot, and her hands moving over wire and post with quiet skill, was a thing he found himself actively trying not to look at too often, which had the predictable effect of making him extremely aware of every moment when he could not avoid it. They talked while they worked. Not continuously, the work required concentration, but in the natural breaks, when a post was set and the next one being marked, or when the water canteen was being passed, and there was a minute to rest in whatever shade a juniper could offer. She told him about Harlan Hollies in the way that people tell you about someone they have loved, not as a recitation of facts, but as a slow accumulation of details that paint a specific and beloved person. Harlan had been opinionated about horses, patient with cattle, and terrible at mathematics, which had been a primary reason for keeping Susanna on, because she was good at it. He had read every book he could get his hands on and had opinions about all of them. He had taught her to ride properly, not because she had not known how to ride, but because his definition of properly was more demanding than most. "He sounds like he expected a great deal of people," David said. "He expected exactly as much as he thought you were capable of," Susanna said, "which was sometimes more than you thought you were capable of, but he was never wrong about it." She told him in a brief, contained way about Missouri. She did not go into detail, but she was not evasive either. Her father had died when she was 15. Her mother had remarried badly. By the time she was 20, she had known it was time to leave, and she had left, and she had been working her way west and southwest, taking whatever work she could find, until she landed in Crail's Crossing, and Harlan had seen her stacking shelves in the general store with the focused competence of someone massively overqualified for the task at hand, and had offered her a job. "Were you afraid when you came here?" David asked. "To the territory? Alone?" She considered the question seriously, which he was learning she did with all questions. "I was afraid the first night," she said. "After that I was too busy to be afraid. I think that is probably true for most people. The fear lives in the moment before the thing. Once you are inside the thing, you are just doing it. That is the most accurate thing I have heard about fear," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "You have been afraid of things." It was not a question, but he answered it. "I was afraid on the ride here," he said. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Of what?" He met her eyes. They were very steady, those amber eyes, and they asked for honesty the way the open country asked for it, not by demanding it, but by making the alternative feel like poor conduct. "That I would arrive and you would take one look at me and send me back the way I came," he said. "And I would have ridden 400 miles and spent everything I had been holding onto for 3 years on the strength of a letter, and I would go back to Kansas with nothing but the knowledge that I had been fool enough to come." She looked at him for a long moment. "And instead, he said carefully, "you gave me cornbread and told me about the west corner fence post." Something moved across her face, something complicated and brief, like light moving over water. Then she looked back at the fence line and picked up the wire, and they went back to work. But he had seen it. And he thought, not certainly, not without the full knowledge that he could be wrong, that she had not sent him away from what he had just said, and that in the language Susanna Reed used, which was precise and gave nothing it had not decided to give, that was not nothing. 3 days into the fence work, Thomas came down from his place to help for an afternoon, bringing his own tools and a cheerful, steady energy that made the work go faster. He took one look at how David and Susanna were working together, the easy, specific communication of two people who have learned each other's physical rhythms and work patterns in a short time, and found a reason to be very interested in a post hole on the far end of the line. Later, riding back, he pulled up alongside David at the point where the tracks to their respective properties divided. "She has not thrown a cooking pot at you," Thomas said. "No," David said. "That is progress," Thomas said, with the straight face of a man who has earned the right to be dry. "Significant progress." David did not rise to it, but he did not deny it either. The north fence was completed the following Friday, and it was triple-stranded and solidly posted and represented, David thought, a line that any man would have to be both determined and obvious to breach. They stood back and looked at it in the afternoon light, and Susanna stood with her hands on her hips and her hat pushed back the way she did when she was surveying something she found satisfactory. "That is a good fence," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him then. "You have been here 3 weeks. 18 days, he said. "Are you counting?" "Yes," he said without apology. She looked at him with that measuring expression she had used on that first morning, except that it was different now because she had more information than she'd had then, and more information in Susanna Reed's eyes resulted in a different quality of attention, deeper, less guarded but no less direct. "I think," she said slowly and with the care she gave to precise statements, "that the arrangement we discussed has become something more straightforward. You have proved yourself useful, more than useful. You have also been," she paused, selecting the word honest, "in ways that were not required by the original terms." "I was not trying to exceed the terms," he said. "I was just being myself." "I know," she said. "That is why I am saying it." He waited. "I would like you to stay," she said. "Not under the original arrangement exactly. I would like you to stay as something more settled, a proper partnership of this property. I am not saying everything at once." She stopped. Something in her expression was unusually unguarded, and he thought that this was probably one of the most difficult things she had said in a long time, and that she had said it anyway, which told him everything about the kind of courage she operated with. "But I am saying that I want you here, on this land, with me." "Then I am here," he said. "For as long as you want me." She nodded, once brisk and resolute, as though she had completed a transaction that required documentation and they could now proceed. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and he stood at the fence line for a moment longer watching her go, the afternoon light finding the auburn in her hair, and he thought that he had never in his life felt so clearly in the right place at the right time. Marcus Harrington came himself, the following Wednesday. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with the well-kept appearance and controlled manner of someone who has spent a long time arranging things, so that he rarely has to deal with resistance in person. He came with Cord Pasley and one other rider, and he came at a civil hour mid-morning, and he dismounted in the yard with the measured courtesy of a man who has decided that civility is the right instrument for this particular situation. David was in the yard repairing a hinge on the barn door when they arrived. He straightened up and watched. He did not approach. Susanna came out of the house, and David saw the moment she recognized Harrington, a single slight tension through her frame, then stillness, then the complete and formidable composure that he had come to understand was her armor. "Mr. Harrington," she said. "Miss Reed." He had a pleasant voice, the kind of voice that has been practiced for dealing with people. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "You are," she said, "but go ahead." Harrington absorbed this with a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "I understand you have taken on a hired hand." He glanced at David with a dismissive neutrality that categorized him as furniture. "That is good. A property this size is a lot for one person." "Yes," she said, It is. I am going to make one more offer, Harrington said. My final offer, and I want you to hear me when I say final because I mean it. $1,500 for the property and the spring water rights. That is a fair price. That is more than a fair price for this country in this year. I know what a fair price for this country in this year is, Susanna said. I also know that you would not be out here in person making a final offer unless the 12 offers before it had worried you somehow, which means you are more afraid of losing this situation than you want me to believe. Harrington's pleasant expression held but stiffened. I am a reasonable man trying to do reasonable business. You are a man who has been cutting my fences and moving my cattle for 6 months, she said, with such clinical precision that it was worse than shouting would have been. I do not do business with men like that. Not for $1,500, not for $5,000. You could come back tomorrow with enough money to buy half the territory and my answer would be the same. There was a silence. Harrington looked at David. You are new here, he said. You might want to think carefully about the situation you have walked into. David set down the hinge and walked across the yard. He stopped at the edge of the porch steps, not on the porch. That was Susanna's space, and she had not invited him to stand in it, but close enough that there was no ambiguity about where he was situated. I have thought about it, David said pleasantly. I find it straightforward. Harrington looked at him for a moment with the flat calculation of a man who is deciding whether an obstacle is worth the trouble. Then he looked back at Susanna with a smile that had gone cold. I hope you know what you are doing, he said. I always do, she said. Harrington turned his horse and rode out of the yard with Pasley and the other rider behind him, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded down the track toward the road, and Susanna stood on the porch for a moment after they were out of sight. Then she said very quietly, Thank you for staying on the ground. He looked up at her. Was that the right thing? Yes, she said. If you had come up the steps uninvited, it would have been the wrong thing. You stayed where you were and you made it clear anyway. That was the right thing. He nodded. Then, because they were standing there and because something about the morning had made it feel possible, he said, You were extraordinary. She looked at him with those direct amber eyes and the faint, complex not-quite smile that he had been seeing more frequently in recent days. I was just precise, she said. I know, he said. That is why I said extraordinary. June moved through the Hollies' property with a grace that the preceding months had not entirely suggested June was capable of offering. The heat rose steadily, but the spring ran clean and the cattle were healthy and the fence held. There were no more night raids on the north boundary, and while David did not believe for a moment that Harrington was finished, the man seemed to have decided to recalibrate his approach, which bought them time and quiet. The quiet, David discovered, was full of things. He and Susanna developed the daily rhythms of two people sharing a working property, a sharing that was proper in its arrangements and genuine in its function, meaning they worked side by side through the practical hours and separated in the evenings, he to the bunkhouse and she to the house. And if there was a degree of constraint in that separation that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with two people who were very aware of each other's presence, neither of them spoke about it directly. What they did was talk. In the evenings, sometimes on the porch, she with her coffee or occasionally a small glass of the rye whiskey she kept in the kitchen cabinet, he with his hat in his hands or his back against the porch rail. They talked about the things people talk about when they are getting to know each other, and are old enough to know that getting to know someone is one of the few activities in life that cannot be hurried without losing something irreplaceable. She told him about what she read. She had a solid shelf of books in the house, accumulated from Harlan's purchases and from her own, and she had opinions about all of them. She told him her opinions with the same directness she brought to everything, and when he disagreed, she argued her point without any of the social softening that women in that time and place were so often obliged to deploy, which he found more refreshing than he had words for. He told her about growing up on a farm in southern Ohio, about the specific loneliness of middle sons in large families, not unloved, but slightly invisible, which was sometimes worse. About the way he had come west after 2 years of going through the motions of a life that fit him only approximately. He told her about the Mueller Ranch and the 2 years of patient, careful work that had been building towards something he could not yet name. You came all this way on the strength of a letter from your brother about a woman he had described as difficult, she said one evening, in a tone that was amused but also genuinely curious. He said you were worth every mile, David said. She was quiet for a moment. He said that. In the letter, not in the part you wrote, in his part. He said you were described as difficult by most of the men in Crail's Crossing, and that he wanted to put his own description on record, which was that you were worth every mile a decent man might ride. She looked out at the darkening yard for a while. I did not know he had said that. I thought you should know, David said. Why? He thought about it. Because someone should have said it to you directly, and since Thomas was not here to do it, I thought I would deliver it. She turned and looked at him. The evening light was doing something to her face that made it hard for him to look away, and he did not look away. Her expression had that unguarded quality again. The quality he now understood was not a lowering of her guard so much as a decision she made, deliberately, to let him see something. David, she said. Yes. I am going to say something, and I need you to let me say the whole thing before you respond. All right, he said. I have spent the last 3 years in particular, but really the last several years building something for myself that does not depend on anyone else. Not out of stubbornness, or not only out of stubbornness. Out of the understanding that depending on other people, in my experience, creates a situation where other people can take things from you. I built this. She gestured at the yard, the dark shapes of the barn and the pasture fence, and the cattle moving against the lighter dark of the sky. I built this because it cannot be taken. It is mine because I earned it and because Harlan trusted me with it. And I have been very careful about what else I let matter to me. Because things that matter to you can be lost, and losing things is something I would rather not be in the habit of. She stopped. He waited because she had said to let her finish and she had not finished. You have been here 6 weeks, she said, and I find that you matter to me, not because I intended it. Not because of the arrangement or the letter or any practical reason. Because of who you are. Because you stayed on the ground when Harrington came. Because you asked how I was afraid instead of telling me I should not be. Because you said I was worth every mile in a way that was not meant to flatter me. Because when we work together I feel less like I am holding this together alone, and I do not hate that as much as I expected to. She stopped again and looked at him with a directness that cost her something, and she was paying it anyway. He wanted very much to say the right thing. He thought about it for just a moment, not because he was uncertain about what was true, but because he wanted to say it without the excess that would make her uncomfortable, and without the restraint that would make it less than it needed to be. I love this land, he said. I have loved it since I rode onto it 6 weeks ago, but I love it because you are on it. Because the way you are on it, the way you move through it and know it and fight for it, I have not been in many places that felt like the right place. This is the right place. You are why. She was quiet for a long time. The night sounds were coming up around them, the insects, the distant cattle, the cooling air moving through the juniper. I am not easy, she said finally. I have been told this my whole life, and I have decided that it is true and that I have no interest in changing it. I know, he said. I read your letter 4 times on the trail. I knew before I arrived. And you came anyway. I saddled up before I finished reading it, he said, and there it was, the smile. The real one, not the almost smile or the corner of the mouth concession to humor, but the full version, the one that changed her whole face and made him feel as though something that had been held at a certain careful distance had just closed the space and arrived where it had been heading all along. That, she said, is either the most foolish thing I have ever heard or the most romantic. Cannot it be both? He said. She looked at him for a long moment more. Then she stood up from her chair and she reached out and she put her hand on the side of his face, a gesture so deliberate and so direct that it was more intimate, somehow, than anything more elaborate would have been, and she said, "Come back tomorrow morning and bring your things from the bunkhouse." He covered her hand with his briefly. "Are you certain?" "I am always certain," she said. "That is one of my qualities." He laughed, actually laughed, a warm, released sound, and she smiled again. The summer settled around them with a completeness that felt both earned and fortunate, which in David's experience was the best kind of completeness. He moved his things into the house on a Thursday morning in early July, which Cal observed with a total absence of surprise, and a small, satisfied nod, and life on the Hollies' property took on the shape of something that was being lived rather than merely maintained. They were married on a Saturday afternoon in late August in the small church at the far end of Crales Crossing's Main Street, with Thomas and his wife Clara standing up with them, and Cal in the front pew in a clean shirt. And the minister, a young man of surprisingly good humor given his profession, performing the ceremony with a brevity and sincerity that Susanna specifically requested. "Short and real," she had told the minister when they met with him the week before. "Not long and ornate." "Short and real I can certainly manage," he had said. It was short and real. David held her hands in front of the small congregation of neighbors and Thomas's ranch hands and a few people from town, and he looked at her in her blue dress, not white. She was practical about that, with her dark auburn hair properly pinned for the occasion, and he said his vows directly to her, not to the room, and she said hers in the same way, with the same steady amber eyes looking back at him. And when the minister said he could kiss his bride, she let him, briefly and entirely sincerely. And there was a warmth of sound from the people behind them that suggested that, even in a small western town in 1878, people knew a real thing when they saw one. Afterward, at the modest celebration that Clara and Thomas organized at the ranch, with a table set outside and cold chicken and bread and one of Clara's spectacular layer cakes, Thomas pulled David aside for just a moment. "I want you to know," Thomas said, "that I was not entirely sure you would come." "I came as fast as I could," David said. "I know. I want you to know that it turned out exactly right." David looked across the yard to where Susanna was talking to Cal, standing in a patch of evening light with her shoes still on for once, and something in her posture was the exact specific relaxation of a person who is, at this particular moment, exactly where they should be. "Yes," he said. "It did." The Harrington situation resolved itself in September in a way that was not dramatic but was definitive. A survey team came out from Santa Fe at the request of the Territorial Land Office, following a formal complaint that Susanna had filed in June, meticulously documented, and established the boundary lines of the Hollies' property in a way that was legally and permanently recorded. The spring and its water rights were confirmed as belonging to the property, as Harlan Hollies' original deed had always stated, and a report was filed with the county regarding the evidence of fence cutting and cattle harassment that Susanna and David had documented over the summer. Marcus Harrington received a formal letter from the Territorial Land Office that made his options very clear. He did not send men to cut the fence again. He did not send Pasley to make offers. He was not a man who folded his operations over one lost contest, but he was also, in the end, a businessman, and the business case for continuing to pursue a property whose owners had just demonstrated that they knew how to use legal and documented channels to defend it was no longer good. Thomas rode down with the news when the letter was confirmed. He found them in the vegetable garden, David hauling compost, Susanna on her knees doing something patient and detailed with the late-season tomato plants. And he leaned on the garden fence and read the relevant paragraph aloud. And Susanna sat back on her heels and listened to it, and then looked at David with an expression that was a complex mixture of vindication and relief, and something deeper than either of those, which was the specific satisfaction of a person who has held a line long enough that the pressure finally gave. 6 years, she said. I have been on this land 6 years, and it is finally just mine. Hours, David said. She looked at him. Yes, she said with a smile. Hours. Thomas folded the letter and handed it to her. Harlan would have been very pleased, he said. She held the letter for a moment. Yes, she said quietly. He would. The first winter of their marriage was a proper New Mexico Territory winter, cold nights, crisp clear days, the occasional snow that turned the red dust country white and made the cattle bunch at the fence lines looking bewildered. David spent it learning the fine grain of the land the way Susanna knew it, which she had told him was a project that would take several years, and she was right about that. But he was methodical and observant, and she was, when the mood took her, an exceptionally good teacher. She was a good teacher because she did not condescend and did not repeat herself, and assumed that if you were paying attention once you would have it. This made David pay very careful attention the first time to everything she said, which she noticed and which, he could tell, she found satisfying. They spent the long winter evenings reading from the shelf of books, or playing cards with a small ruthlessness that delighted them both since they were evenly matched, or simply sitting by the fire in a silence that had the quality of something complete. He had not known, before this, that silence could have a quality like that, an inhabited quality, warm and specific rather than empty. He thought about it sometimes, the difference between the silences he had experienced before Susanna and the silences he experienced now, and he thought that the difference was something that had to do with the person in the silence with you, with whether that person had a weight to them, a presence, a particular gravity that made the air between you feel full rather than empty. Susanna had that gravity in abundance. She also had opinions about card games, strong feelings about the correct way to make coffee, a habit of waking very early and going outside before he was awake to stand in the yard in the pre-dawn dark, for reasons she described only as thinking, and a capacity for work that genuinely alarmed him from time to time in the sense that he had to remind himself that she was capable of doing the entire ranch's necessary labor without him, and had been doing so for years. Which meant that his contribution had to be genuine and useful or it would become invisible. He worked to ensure it was genuine and useful. She noticed. In February she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, standing in the kitchen while the coffee was coming to boil, with the direct simplicity she brought to important things, not as a dramatic announcement, but as information she was conveying to someone who had a right to it. He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down at the kitchen table, because his legs had made a unilateral decision about the matter. She watched him with an expression that was amused and gentle in equal parts. "You are sitting down," she said. "I am," he said. "Are you all right?" "I am extraordinarily all right," he said. "I just needed to sit." She came and sat across from him, and they looked at each other across the table in the morning light with the coffee boiling behind her and the winter outside the window, and he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am also extraordinarily all right," she said, with the smile that always made him feel like something significant had been unlocked. "I wanted to be sure I was certain before I told you, and I am certain. I have been for a few weeks." "A few weeks," he said. "I needed to be sure before I told anyone," she said, in a tone that reminded him, gently and specifically, that she was a woman who had been self-reliant for a long time, and that her instinct to be certain before she shared something important was not a withholding but a kind of careful stewardship. "I understand," he said. And he did. She squeezed his hands. He squeezed back. Outside, the New Mexico Territory winter moved through the junipers with a sound like distant conversation. Cal, when told the news, reacted with an emotional gruffness that consisted of him turning away for a moment, and then turning back and clearing his throat and saying, "Well, that is good news. That is the best news this place has had in some time." He then went to the barn and was unusually productive for the rest of the day. Thomas and Clara came down the following Sunday, and Clara, who was a warm and practically minded woman who had seen Susanna's independent quality from the beginning and respected it thoroughly, sat with her at the kitchen table, while the men were outside, and they talked about the practical matters of it. And Susanna, David noticed when he came back inside and saw the two of them at the table with their coffee cups close, seemed to be receiving the conversation as something she had not entirely known she needed. The specific companionship of another woman who understood what she was navigating. He was glad of it. The spring came back to the land with the slow, reliable generosity it always brought to that country, the grass greening on the south range, the spring running full and clear, the cottonwoods along the creek throwing their first pale leaves. David spent the spring mornings doing the work that spring on a cattle ranch requires, and found that the work felt different from the inside of something he was building rather than the outside of something he was maintaining for someone else. Every fence post had a different weight to it. Every acre of pasture clearing meant something specific. It was his land, too, in the way that Thomas had hoped it would be and Susanna had agreed it could be. And that sense of specific belonging to a specific place was something he had not had before and had not known how much he needed. Susanna worked through the spring with characteristic determined practicality, adjusting what needed adjusting as the months progressed, refusing to be treated as fragile and being correct in that refusal. And she and David negotiated the necessary conversations about that subject with a directness and mutual respect that was, he thought, one of the best things about the way they worked together. Their son was born in early October of 1879, delivered by the doctor who came out from Crayle's Crossing on a brisk autumn morning, and he arrived noisily and with vigorous opinion, which seemed to David entirely appropriate. They named him James Harlan Barker James for no particular reason except that it was a solid, uncomplicated name that stood on its own, and Harlan because Susanna had said, when they were talking about names in the summer, that it was the least she could do. David watched Susanna hold the baby in the afternoon light of the room where he had been born, the main bedroom of the adobe house, with the light coming in golden through the west window, and he thought about the letter in his coat pocket which he had kept this whole time. He had not told her he had kept it. He told her now. "You kept it," she said, looking up from the baby with an expression that was partly astonished and partly something softer. "From the first day," he said. He took it from the inside pocket where it had traveled with him through everything. "I am going to frame it." She looked at him for a long moment. The baby made a small, decisive sound. "You are sentimental," she said. "Tremendously," he said. "I said in the letter I was not looking for sentiment." "Yes," he said. "You also said nothing was promised beyond the first meeting, and here we are." She looked at the letter in his hand, the folded page, worn now at the creases from a year and a half of being carried, and then she looked at him with the full, direct, luminous quality of her attention that was the thing he had loved about her first, before he had fully understood it was love. "Here we are," she said. The years settled over the Hollies Barker property. It was called that now in the county records, Susanna having negotiated the recording of both names when they had formally combined the property documentation, with the specific kind of grace that belongs to places that have been hard won. Cal stayed on for 3 more years before his knees made ranching impossible, and he retired to a small house in Crayle's Crossing, where Susanna visited him every week and brought him the sweet cornbread he liked and argued with him about books, which was the form their friendship took, and which suited them both. When he died in the spring of 1883, he left a short, surprisingly eloquent note for Susanna that said, among other things, "You were the best thing that happened to this land since the spring, and that is saying quite a lot." She read it at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept the things that mattered. Thomas and Clara moved to a slightly larger spread north of Crayle's Crossing in 1881 and remained, throughout everything, the closest of neighbors in the way that the word neighbor means in open country, not geographically close so much as reliably, trustworthily present. Thomas and David rode together on cattle drives twice a year, and maintained the comfortable silence of men who have been brothers long enough that words are optional. And Clara and Susanna developed a friendship of the genuine and durable variety that involved strong opinions about many things and a mutual enjoyment of those opinions' collision. Marcus Harrington's operation declined through the early 1880s as the water problem on his eastern land worsened, and his financial overextension in several other ventures became apparent. He sold the majority of his holdings in 1882 and left the territory, which Susanna received as news with a single nod and a specific silence that contained, David thought, the entire 6 years of what the man had put her through, and the fact that the land was still hers and she was still on it. James grew into a serious, curious boy who had his mother's amber eyes and his father's methodical quality, and who showed an early and passionate interest in cattle breeding that delighted both of them in ways that were partly practical and partly the particular warmth of watching a child become specifically themselves. He was 4 years old when his sister, Margaret, was born in November of 1883, a fiercely cheerful baby with dark auburn hair like Susanna's, and a propensity for making her opinions heard that suggested she was going to be, as Cal would have said, the best kind of trouble. The house expanded to accommodate them. A back room built in the summer of 1882, a new porch covering added the following winter, the kitchen enlarged by a few feet at Susanna's very specific instruction. David was not a natural carpenter, but he was careful and teachable, and he did the work with Cal's assistance, and then, after Cal could no longer manage it, with Thomas's, and the additions were solid even if they were not elegant, and Susanna pronounced them adequate, which in Susanna's lexicon meant she was satisfied. The vegetable garden grew more elaborate every year. The cattle herd grew. The horses multiplied. They added a breeding pair in 1880, and by 1884 had a respectable string that people in the county came to buy from with regularity. The spring kept running clean. The fence held. On an evening in the late autumn of 1884, 6 years after David Barker had saddled his horse in Millhaven and pointed it west on the strength of a letter, he sat on the porch of the house with his wife and watched the sun go down over the mesa. James was asleep inside. Margaret, 2 months past her first birthday, was asleep as well, with the profound, committed sleep of small children who have tired themselves out completely with the business of being alive. The air smelled of juniper and cooling earth and the faint smoke from the chimney, and the sky was doing what it did in that country in autumn, turning a color that had no real name in any language David knew, something between red and copper and gold, with the blue of the upper atmosphere coming down at the edges like the hem of something vast and unhurried. Susanna had her coffee. He had his hat in his hands, turning the brim the way he sometimes did when he was thinking. "David," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He looked at her. She was asking it the way she asked real questions, not rhetorically, not to be reassured, but because she genuinely wanted to know the state of the thing and found that asking directly was the most efficient and honest way to find out. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" She looked out at the copper sky for a moment. He watched her profile in the fading light, the strong line of her jaw, the way the late sun found the auburn in her hair, the specific quality of her stillness that was never emptiness but always presence. "Harlan used to say," she said slowly, "that happiness was not something you found. He said it was something you built, same as a fence line, and that it required the same things, the right materials, the right tools, regular maintenance, and the knowledge that the wind was going to test it eventually and you had to build it to hold." "He was a wise man," David said. "He was," she said. "I thought about it for a long time, what he said." She turned and looked at David with those direct, amber, steady eyes. "I think this is what he meant. This exactly." He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. She turned her hand over and held his. "I think you are right," he said. They sat that way while the sky darkened and the stars began to come out over the mesa, one by one, with the deliberate and unhurried arrival of things that have been there all along and simply needed the right kind of dark to become visible. The cattle in the south pasture made their settling sounds. The cottonwoods along the creek moved gently. Inside the house, their children slept. The spring ran on, as it had been running for longer than any of them had been alive, clean and cold and certain, underneath the red earth of a piece of country that a woman had refused to give up, and a man had ridden 400 miles to stand beside, on the strength of 12 lines of dark, pressured handwriting and a brother's note that said she was worth every mile. She had been. She was. She would be. David Barker had known it before he finished the letter. He had known it with the specific, unargued certainty of things that are true before they can be proven, and the years had done nothing but confirm what the letter had already told him. He tightened his hand around hers. She looked at him once more in the last of the copper light, with the smile he had been watching for 6 years, and still found that it arrived like something new, like the first good weather after a long hard season, like water in dry country, like a lamp in a window at the end of a long ride home. "Come inside when you are ready," she said. "I will make supper." "In a minute," he said. She stood and she went inside, and he sat for 1 minute more in the dark and the cooling air and the vast, unhurried country all around, and he was, in a way that had nothing provisional or uncertain about it, home. He got up. He went inside. The door closed behind him, warm and solid against the night.